Greening got to Alaska, he was shocked by what he saw. Alaska's bounty had become big business. Outside interests were exploiting the territory, taking its resources and leaving.
We let the outside interests rape the land and run away with the profits.
The canneries took so many salmon, they threatened the runs, and the territory was powerless to stop it. Greening said the only way to change that was to become a state.
His dream was for Alaska to become a state. He was quite determined that it would become a state.
Time and again, we have petitioned the Congress of the United States, asking help to develop this great land of ours, to prevent its resources from being drained, to give ourselves a voice in the control of our own destiny. I tell you, there's only one way that Alaska can ever realize its future, and that is to become a state. That's right.
Greening's dream became a movement of the people, and the statehood campaign went to Congress. In Washington, Alaska had a powerful advocate in Bob Bartlett, the territory's voteless delegate to Congress.
As a delegate to Congress, he could introduce legislation, but he had no votes, so he had nothing to trade. Yet he had many bills passed. I think in one legislative session, congressional session, he had more bills passed than anyone else, and that obviously was due to his personality, his ability to work with people.
But Bartlett's influence was not enough. Congress was opposed to statehood. Many were swayed by Winton Arnold, a lobbyist for the salmon industry and a relentless opponent of statehood.
Arnold, then he never said, I'm against statehood, but then he would proceed to lay out reasons why Alaska would never be able to afford statehood.
They had very, very big charts and very descriptive arguments of how costly it was going to be and that people were going to be taxed.
It doomed the statehood movement for years. How could a tiny population with one industry pay for the roads and schools and other services funded by state government? The tax base was too small.
Can we afford it? And it was a pretty handy issue for opponents to rely on. And it was the one, as I said earlier, that was the most difficult to handle and which had the greatest continuing validity in my judgment.
I did question our ability to finance statehood. One, we didn't have oil, wasn't even on the horizon back then, and our capabilities of financing appeared very grim indeed.
A key point in the state's lawsuit is that Congress repeatedly turned down statehood based on the financial issue.
There have been 16 attempts to make us a state since 1916 on. In almost every single case, there was one prevailing reason that ran as a thread throughout all of these, the opposition to our statehood, and that was that the congressmen who opposed statehood looked at Alaska and said there was no way we could afford the cost of government.
Alaska would need a lot of land and control of its resources to survive. In 1950, the House passed a statehood bill granting about 20 million acres, but some Alaskans said it wasn't good enough.
It gave us 23 million acres of land, didn't give us any of the resource, none of the 90-10, none of the things we needed, and I said it won't work.
Walter Hickel, a carpenter and builder from Anchorage, went to Washington to demand more land.
I got into Taft's office, and I started talking, and I remember pulling my chair up in front of his desk, and I'm really going at it. And Senator Welker from Idaho, I had raised some ruckus before that about that nobody's listening to us, and so they sent Senator Welker up the year before that, and just a young senator, so he was sitting there with me, and he said, young man, how much land do you think you need? And I blurted out 100 million acres. And as I was walking out of there, I was sick to my stomach. I said, I wonder how much land we have. And it was the truth. It was true. And so they called down to Interior, and they called down. Pretty soon they came back and said, you have 365 million acres. And I said we should ask for half of it.
Soon after, a House committee proposed a 100 million acre land grant. The measure was defeated, but it set a precedent, one that opened the door to giving more land, more resources to Alaska to fund its government. As the statehood movement unfolded, Alaskans began flying to Washington at their own expense to lobby for statehood.
Even though we were non-voting little peons of some peculiar political status in the national culture, when we went back to Washington and talked to Congress, they'd listen. And when they'd ask us, who paid your way here? And we could say, we paid it. They want to know, why did you do it? Well, then you tell them, why? We got to have this in Alaska. They're there for a reason.
But the opposition in Congress was formidable. In 1955, Alaskans tried a new strategy.
One of the prime objections to Alaska was that the rest of the country thought its citizens were these social misfits who were not capable of governing themselves. And so the statehood promoters said, well, how do we show that we're capable of governing ourselves? Well, one of the ways we could do this is hold a constitutional convention that would be a model of procedure, and that would produce a model constitution.
55 delegates were elected from all over Alaska, some with no legislative experience. The delegates chose as their leader Bill Egan, a soft-spoken grocer from Valdez with a deep love for Alaska.
He had been a figure in the state legislature, but by chairing the Constitutional Convention, he amazed people with the political insight and the sense of order and devotion that he could bring out in people. He got people to believe in themselves.
The delegates had just 75 days to write a constitution. As the deadline neared, they crafted the words all Alaskans would live by.
There was a lot of work being done during the last days, and at the same time, it was also an emotional a volcano, you might say, coming out and sort of ready to blast forth.
I felt like I had been, part of something very special. And I sensed that it was the bringing together of Alaska. And when I had to call the roll the last time, I could hardly get through it. I was choked up. And I looked up, and there wasn't a dry eye in the place.